your tour and your talk, and then maybe we'll turn our attention to the situation in the UK. Okay, so you're planning on showing your audiences footage from your journeys through the Middle East for the last 6 months. So I guess I'm curious about, well, you didn't step into the conflict in the Middle East as a naive observer, either of people or of societies. But my suspicions are that you've seen a lot more in the last 6 months than you ever really wanted to see. And so I'm curious about what you've seen, what you've concluded from that, and how it's altered or extended your viewpoint, or challenged it for that matter. Like, you've been poking your nose into very dangerous places. And so what's been the consequence for you, and what is it that you're hoping to shed a light on with the imagery in particular, let's say? What are you hoping to shed a light on for the people who are going to come and hear you talk?
Well, there's quite a lot of things. I mean, I've covered a lot of conflicts before, including in the Middle East, and a lot of what has been happening is sadly familiar territory to me. There are, though, as you and I have discussed before, there's a reason why hell is a pit that's endless, and when it comes to violence and the ability to commit acts of evil, it seems to me that that axiom that the pit is just endless has really been shown in the last year. I've been in Israel and Gaza most of the time since the 7th, and yes, I mean, of course, like anyone reporting from the front line, seen lots of things that I'd rather not have seen. But I mean, my belief is that there's a very important role in society for people who do that and come back and tell everyone else what it's like. Not least, of course, to warn people. I mean, there's lots of things that, I've seen as a reporter, and the reporter from war zones, which I know I would not want other people to see. I know I didn't want to see myself. But in order for other people not to see that, you have to know where people can go. And, I mean, like, one of the things that has struck me a lot in the last year has been that and I've made this comment a couple of times in pieces and elsewhere, that the terrorists of the 7th in particular were deeply gleeful whilst carrying out acts of unbelievable barbarism. And that's something that's something I've been thinking about a lot, because to be doing something you think is right but is evil is one thing. To be doing something that is evil and being joyful about it is and for people around you to celebrate it, and then at several degrees of remove, that people who think they've got the same cause as you would excuse it, or say well context, or much like that, all sorts of things like that are just alarming. And I've often thought, actually, in recent months, there was a late a historian and writer called Gita Sareni, who died about 20 years ago, made a great impact on me when I was growing up. She wrote, among other things, a biography of the child killer Mary Bell, and also the biographies of Stangl, the camp commandant at Treblinka, who she interviewed, and also of Albert Speer. I remember reading an interview with Gita Sareni towards the end of her life, and she was not a religious person particularly, but she said, having spent a lot of her life considering evil and staring at evil and writing about evil, she said it feels like a force that descends. It just manifests, and there's no other explanation for it. It isn't just about some problem in the developmental process, or simply a matter of education or opportunity. Is that on top of all those problems that do exist, sometimes there is an incarnation of evil in the world.
Are you tired of feeling sluggish, run down, or just...
Wow, that quote from Gita Sareni is very, very powerful, folks. I mean, this is a woman who is, Douglas was saying, interviewed human personifications of evil for most of her life. interviews with some of the most vile, contemptible, evil humans that were, roaming the planet, that were in societies that allowed evil incarnate to exist, not only allowed them to exist, but gave birth to them. And the quote that she had, I just want to make it say, is that evil is a force that just descends slowly. And I think sometimes, folks, when we see these shows, when let's just say that the mainstream media shows actually started to do journalism back in the day, and we would see on shows like 2020 or NBC Investigates, any of those that were out there on the mainstream media, and they were interviewing a serial killer or a serial rapist, or they were interviewing somebody who committed, evil acts, like Jeffrey Dahmer, son of all these, right? And when you, when you saw the interviews, that personification of evil, that dissension of blackness, or whatever you want to call it, right? That, we associate, that dark, just that it, that evil personification, that everything seems to just go, dark around that object, dark around that person. And you can sense it, you can feel it. The cells in your body are screaming and saying, there is something wrong with that person, with that society, with that person who's talking. And I really think that that's exactly what, that if you were to go and talk to and have an interview with some of these evil people, evil entities, you would feel that, and you would come out that completely changed, completely changed. And then Douglas talks about the terrorists, that they're committing these acts of terrorism, committing these atrocities, committing these acts against fellow human beings, but they don't consider them to be human beings. In fact, they consider them to be basically not human beings. I mean, people say, oh, they consider you so lower than human beings. Well, that means they have to at least associate you temporarily with being a human being and then subjugate you to some life form below that. For them to commit these kind of atrocities, and then Douglas says, well, there's one thing that you're committing the atrocities, but there's another one that you're laughing about it, you're dancing, you're celebrating, you're phoning home, telling, what you've done, how many people you've committed an act of violence on, how many people you've killed. And so it's going to be, I'm hoping that Douglas, comes to a town near us here in the Carolinas. I'd love to go to see, his presentation and to see the video footage, the raw, unedited video footage that he's going to be showing of what he saw out there reporting back as a wartime reporter. That's going to be also very sobering to those people that go to see it. And I'm sure eventually it'll be put online, hopefully, so we all can get a chance to. A documentary would be great. A documentary hosted by Douglas Murray. Oh, come on now. It doesn't get any better than that. Just so we can actually see the atrocities. Because everybody says, oh, that's not what happened. It was, they didn't commit any harm. They didn't, they killed some people, but it wasn't a big deal. It wasn't a lot of people. It wasn't a massacre. These are the things that, you hear from people. It was all staged. It's unbelievable. And I'll leave with one last thought. That is, remember we saw the stories of people around the world, Gen Z, millennials, young people. I don't know if it's that many older people, but mostly young people were ripping down the posters of Jewish children that either were taken hostage or that they couldn't be found, and they were ripping those posters off of, street poles, lamp posts, walls, buildings, whatever. You wouldn't rip off a poster of a missing pet, a missing cat, a missing dog. But they're ripping down the posters of children who happen to be Jewish just because they want to get their point across and want to protest what's going on in Gaza. Anyways, folks, you're watching the Dr. Nasir Shaikh Show. I'm your host, Dr. Nasir. If you haven't done so already, we'd love for you to subscribe to the channel, like, share, and follow us. You all know what it does. It helps us out, gets our content out. Let's get back to more of Jordan and Douglas right now.
That I think even technically is that, because I've been thinking about this a lot in relationship to these new large language models, and there's a statistical probability that any given concept will be associated with any other given concept. And if your mapping is technologically advanced enough, you can calculate those statistical relationships. And that's what the large language models do. And then you can start to map mathematically what the psychoanalysts called complexes. And complexes are systems of ideas that occur in each other's proximity, and there's a core to them. And one of the ways of imagining the theological representations of evil, the legions of devils, let's say, that are behind the generation of the bottomless pit of hell, is that they are representations of complex of ideas that hang together. I think you put your finger on the core of it, actually. The core of it isn't evil. The core of it is gleeful evil. Right?
Yes,
so it's not merely the evil. And it's
rejoicing in evil.
Yeah, well, and that is actually the core of sadism from a psychopathological perspective, right? It's not, it's positive delight. It's a multidimensional characterization. It's positive delight in the unnecessary suffering of others, right? And the unnecessary element is also cardinal because that plays up the element that's parody. So in Auschwitz, for example, one of the games the guards used to play was to have the prisoners who got off the train cars shivering and frozen and accompanied by their dead relatives who, died of asphyxiation or froze to death in the cattle cars. They'd arrive at the camps and then they'd be compelled to carry wet sacks of salt from one side of the camp, which was the size of a town, to the other, and then back. And so it's a parody of work, right? And it's a demonstration to the person themselves that not only are they suffering for all the reasons that they're in the camps and by the fact of the burden that they're carrying, but the utter counterproductive pointlessness of the painful labor is also emphasized and insisted upon, and then delight taken in that. And that is a very dark thing to observe.
Yes, I was in the one of the maximum security prisons in Israel earlier this year and saw the Hamas terrorists from the 7th who had been captured alive. One of them was somebody who I recognized from one of the atrocity videos, who had there were two young boys, about 10 and 12. They were with their father. They went into the safe room when the bombs started falling. And the Hamas terrorists came and they saw them go and they threw a grenade, and the father threw himself on the grenade and was killed in front of his sons. And then, one of them lost an ear and the other one lost an eye, and they were staggering around the main room of their house, weeping and wailing in the most unforgettable, awful way. And one of the terrorists came in, and who'd just killed their father in front of them, came in and opened the fridge and helped himself to the food. And the youngest of the boys, in total trauma, and said, "That's my mother's food." And the terrorist turned to him and said, "Where's your mother? I want her too." How could anyone do that? You
put your finger on it. Well, that idea of the descent is like one of the things that God accuses Cain of when he becomes bitter is opening the door to evil. He said his suffering wasn't merely a consequence of his failure in life. It was a consequence of his failure tempting him to open the door to evil. And so if you think about it in terms of these complexes of associated ideas, they're ideas that if you let in, they bring a host of other ideas with them. And a host is exactly the right phrase. And you might be tempted in a moment of weakness to invite something in that you think that you can control or that you could bend to your own purposes. But the problem is that you're inviting in a complex that has been around forever and that once lodged inside you might prove that whatever defenses that you might think you have there to mount are trivial in comparison to the power of what you've invited in. And that is, I think you can think of that technically, and it is a terrible thing. And it is the kind of things that are warned against at the theological level, although that's a very complicated thing to untangle. And so, all right, so let's turn from that a bit. So that's the sort of thing that you're going to explain.
You know, that last part where Jordan was talking about, I guess he was linking it up and talking it more in terms of a theological, question of good versus evil, and bringing in some, biblical, stories. I think that we could take that and put it into the political realm or the social sciences realm. And just like Jordan was saying, is that, you might be taking a look at something and it might have had some components of, let's say, bad, and however you want to put stuff into that terminology, bad. Or let's say something that's evil, or that's like, for example, a lot of people say socialism, communism, Nazism, Marxism, they're evil. But there are so many people in this current day, people on the left, liberals, statists, that say, well, you know what? That communism was bad and evil, and Nazism, that was bad. But we're not talking about that kind of communism or that kind of Marxism or that kind of socialism or that kind of Nazism. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about a good form of communism. It just hasn't been done properly yet. A good form of socialism, a good form of Marxism. And if we only had that, we would have peace and tranquility, and it would be a kumbaya for everybody around the globe. And as Jordan so aptly puts, what happens when these time-tested, not theories, these are actual things that actually happened to people on a global scale, an uncontrollable death and destruction occurred, where they talk about 100 million people over the last 100 years plus have died because of things like Nazism, socialism, Marxism, communism. But do you think you can bring those evil isms and somehow control them yourself and not be affected? What's that saying? Absolute power corrupts absolutely. Absolute evil is absolute evil. It will never be good. Never. Anyways, folks, we appreciate you taking the time to watch. You've been watching the Dr. Nasir Shaikh Show. I've been your host. My name is Dr. Nasir. If you haven't done so already, subscribe to the channel, like, share, and follow. You all know what to do. Take a look at our video links. They should be above and below. My final thought is always, when you're right, you're right, and when you're left, you're wrong. Until next time, folks, take care and stay safe.